Zira's spaceship crashed on the remote planet with a violent shake that sent her tumbling across the metal floor. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the explosion. The ship's systems failed one by one as sparks flew around her. Her heart raced as she pulled herself from the wreckage, her body battered and bruised. The control panel had been smashed, and the view through the cracked windows was unclear. She couldn't see much of the planet, but what little she could see made her heart sink. The landscape outside was dry and barren, a wasteland of dust and rocks. She needed to find help. She needed to survive. Zira was a member of the peaceful Zortha species, an alien race known for their quiet ways and their willingness to trust others. They had often traded with humans in the past. The humans had been kind to them, offering protection, supplies, and knowledge. But this planet, which the humans had once called a peaceful home, now felt different. Now, Zira was alone. As the smoke from the wreckage cleared, Zira stumbled outside. The sky was an eerie shade of orange, and a hot wind blew dust into her face. She could feel the weight of her injuries. Her leg was twisted awkwardly, and blood dripped from a gash on her forehead. Her hand pressed against the wound, but it didn't help much. Zira knew that she had to find help before it was too late. The first human settlement she found was small, just a collection of wooden huts surrounded by a high wall. Her heart lifted at the sight of the familiar symbol of humanity, a flag flapping in the wind. But as she approached, something didn't feel right. The humans inside were moving around, but none of them seemed to notice her. She took a step closer, waving her arms in the air, her voice weak as she called out, "Please, help me." But no one came. She took another step, but the sound of the door creaking open startled her. A man appeared in the doorway, but when he saw Zira, he stopped. His eyes widened, and his hand went to the gun at his side. Zira's heart sank as she saw the look in his eyes. Fear, suspicion, maybe even hatred. Without saying a word, the man turned and walked back inside, slamming the door shut. Zira stood there, frozen. She felt the weight of rejection pressing down on her chest. She thought the humans would help her. They had helped her people before. Why weren't they helping her now? With a sense of growing despair, Zira turned away from the settlement and continued her search. The landscape stretched out before her, endless and desolate. There were no signs of life, no sign of anyone willing to offer help. As the hours passed, Zira's strength began to fade. Her body was growing weaker, and her vision blurred. She could feel the heat of the planet burning her skin. She stumbled over rocks, falling several times as her legs became too tired to hold her up. Finally, she collapsed beneath a rocky overhang. The pain in her body was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the crushing loneliness that filled her heart. She thought of her family, of her friends. Back home, they had always believed in the kindness of others. They had believed that the humans would be there for them if they needed help. Zira had trusted that belief. But now she wasn't sure. Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise in the distance. Zira's head snapped up, and she struggled to sit up, her eyes searching for the source of the sound. It was a vehicle, slow and heavy, making its way along the dusty road. Zira's heart leaped. This could be her chance. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling, and waved her arms again, hoping this time someone would see her. The vehicle approached slowly, a military-style truck with humans inside. Zira's hopes soared, and she limped toward them. As the truck stopped in front of her, the humans inside stared at her with wide eyes. One of them leaned out, looking at Zira. His face was unreadable. Are you okay?" the man asked. His voice was cautious, almost reluctant. Zira could barely speak, but she managed to say, "Help. I'm hurt. Please." The man didn't move. Instead, he looked toward the other humans in the truck, then back at Zira. He shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cold. "There's nothing we can do for you." Before Zira could say anything else, the truck revved its engine and drove away, leaving her standing in the dust. Zira stood there, staring at the empty road, her mind racing. Why? Why were the humans rejecting her? Why wouldn't they help her? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away, determined not to break down. She needed to stay strong. She had to survive. But as the sun began to set and the darkness of the night crept in, Zira realized one painful truth. She was truly alone. Zira stumbled forward, her body weak and her heart heavy with the weight of despair. The humans she had encountered so far had made it clear that they didn't care. Her people had told stories of human bravery and kindness, of how humans would never abandon an ally in need. But here, on this harsh planet, that hope was fading with each step she took. Her leg throbbed with pain as she moved, but Zira refused to stop. She had no choice. She couldn't let herself die in a place like this. She needed to find food, water, and shelter, but more than that, she needed someone to care. The next settlement was a small village, a cluster of simple homes surrounded by walls made of metal and wood. The faint smell of cooking food filled the air, and Zira's stomach growled. She hadn't eaten in days. She approached the village slowly, her heart pounding. There had to be someone who would help her here. She reached the gate and knocked gently, hoping that someone would hear her and offer a kind word. After a long moment, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her face tired but kind. Zira could see the hint of curiosity in her eyes as she looked at the alien girl standing before her. "Can I help you?" the woman asked softly. Zira tried to smile, but it was hard. Her lips were cracked from the dry air, and her body felt weak. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm hurt. I need help." The woman took a step back, her eyes flickering nervously. She glanced over her shoulder, as if considering something. Zira could feel the tension in the air, the hesitation. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice cold now. "I can't help you." Zira blinked, shocked. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Please, I have no one." The woman's eyes shifted to the ground. "It's not safe," she muttered. "You're not like us. It's best if you leave." Before Zira could respond, the door slammed shut with a loud thud. Zira stood there, frozen. She had never felt so alone in her life. Her body shook with exhaustion and pain, but it was the rejection that hurt the most. She had expected kindness, but instead she was met with fear and suspicion. What had happened to the humans she had heard about, the ones who were always ready to lend a hand? She turned away, tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't have time to cry. She had to keep moving. There was no other choice. The next few days passed in a blur. Zira wandered from one settlement to the next, each one as cold and unwelcoming as the last. Every time she approached, she was turned away. Some humans refused to even look at her, while others whispered behind closed doors, their voices full of fear. Zira couldn't understand it. Why were they afraid of her? She wasn't dangerous. She was just a girl who needed help. But to them, she was an alien, an outsider. To them, she was something to be feared, something to be rejected. She came across a small group of humans sitting by a fire one evening, their laughter and voices carrying on the wind. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should approach. Maybe they would be different. Maybe they would help her. But as she stepped closer, she saw the looks they gave her. The way their eyes widened in fear, how their hands moved toward the weapons at their sides. She stopped in her tracks, feeling a wave of hopelessness wash over her. It was the same everywhere. She couldn't escape it. "I'm not dangerous." She wanted to shout, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she turned and walked away, her feet dragging through the dirt. The loneliness was unbearable. She hadn't seen another Zortha since the crash. She didn't even know if her people had survived the destruction of their ship. She was all alone in a strange world, and the humans, the ones who had once seemed so kind and noble, had turned their backs on her. Zira's body grew weaker with each passing day. She had no food, no water, and no one to turn to. Her skin was dry, her eyes sunken, and every movement was a struggle. The hot wind of the planet stung her face, and her limbs felt as if they were made of lead. She lay down beneath a tree one night, too exhausted to go any farther. The stars above seemed so distant, so unreachable. She thought of her family, her friends, and wondered if they were looking at the same sky, thinking of her. Would they ever find her? Or had they forgotten her already? As the night grew colder, Zira pulled her knees to her chest, trying to stay warm. She closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep, but the nightmares came. The faces of the humans who had rejected her flashed before her eyes, their cold gazes haunting her every thought. Zira awoke the next morning to the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. Was it another group of humans? Would they turn her away too? A figure emerged from the distance. A man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in military gear. Zira's heart skipped a beat. He looked different from the others she had encountered. His eyes were focused, his movements purposeful. He wasn't running away from her. He was coming toward her. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. Zira didn't answer at first. She was too weak to speak, but her eyes locked onto his, desperate for any sign of kindness. Would this man be different? Would he help her? "I'm hurt," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need help." The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "All right," he said, kneeling beside her. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Zira's heart raced. Finally, someone was offering help. She didn't know who he was or where he came from, but for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. The man who found Zira was different from the others. He didn't run when he saw her, didn't pull away in fear. Instead, he knelt beside her, his face calm but filled with concern. His name was Captain Jonas Darnell, a soldier from a distant military unit. Zira had never seen someone like him before, but there was something in his eyes, a depth, an understanding, that made her trust him immediately. "Can you stand?" Darnell asked gently, his hand offering support. Zira, too weak to speak, nodded slowly. She had no energy left, but she didn't want to appear helpless. She needed help, yes, but she didn't want to seem weak. Yet, standing proved to be harder than she thought. Her legs wobbled, and she nearly collapsed, but Darnell was quick to catch her. "Easy there," he said softly, steadying her. "You've been through a lot. Let's get you to a safe place." Zira couldn't remember the last time someone had been so kind. She had wandered for days, feeling more and more abandoned, but now, this human was offering her help. She leaned into his side, grateful but too exhausted to speak. Darnell led her away from the open ground, guiding her to a small camp that was set up a few miles away. There, a few other soldiers sat around a fire, cooking food and chatting. They looked up as Darnell and Zira approached. One of the soldiers, a tall woman with short brown hair, raised an eyebrow. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice skeptical. Darnell motioned for her to quiet down. "She's not a threat, just a survivor from the wreckage. Let's get her settled." The woman nodded but didn't say anything further. Zira was guided to a small cot, and Darnell placed a blanket over her. The warmth was comforting, but Zira didn't feel completely at ease. She had learned to expect rejection, to expect fear, but Darnell hadn't pushed her away. For that, she was thankful. "I'll get you something to eat," Darnell said after a moment, noticing that Zira's eyes were half closed from exhaustion. "You need to rest." Zira's mind buzzed with 1,000 questions, but she was too tired to ask them. Instead, she nodded and closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift into a fitful sleep. She woke a short time later to the smell of something cooking. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her just how long it had been since she had eaten anything. She sat up carefully, the pain in her leg making her wince, but she was too hungry to care. Darnell returned with a bowl of food. It smelled like stew, warm and hearty. He handed it to her, and Zira accepted it without hesitation. She was starving, but as she ate, she couldn't help but notice the way the soldiers watched her from across the camp. They weren't rude, but they were cautious. They were waiting to see what she would do, how she would behave. When Zira finished the meal, Darnell sat beside her, watching her with a serious expression. "You've been through a lot," he said, his voice low. "I don't know what happened to your ship, but we're going to figure this out. We'll get you to safety." Zira looked at him, her throat tight. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly. "I don't know where to go. My people." She trailed off, unsure how to explain the wreckage of her world. She didn't even know if any of her people had survived. The thought was too painful to put into words. Darnell didn't press her. Instead, he gave her a soft nod. "It's okay," he said, his voice reassuring. "We don't have all the answers yet, but we'll find them. For now, just rest. We'll take it one step at a time." Zira didn't know how to respond. She had never felt more alone, yet in Darnell's presence, there was a small flicker of hope. He wasn't like the others. He didn't look at her as if she was some kind of monster. He didn't look at her as if she was weak. Instead, he saw her as someone who needed help, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Zira allowed herself to believe that help might actually come. The night passed slowly. Zira lay awake, staring at the fire as it crackled in the center of the camp. The soldiers around the fire whispered to each other in low tones, their words unintelligible to her. She didn't understand their language, but she didn't need to. It was the way they spoke, casual, relaxed, that comforted her. They didn't treat her like a stranger, at least not completely. As the fire dimmed and the soldiers settled in for the night, Darnell walked over to her cot. He had his rifle slung over his shoulder, but his expression was softer now. "We'll head out in the morning," he said, his voice calm. "There's a safe zone a few days away. It's a big human settlement. Maybe they'll have answers." Zira nodded, feeling a little lighter at the thought. A settlement full of humans. She didn't know what to expect, but at least it was something. At least it was a chance. Darnell watched her for a moment, then gave her a small smile. "Get some rest. You're safe here." Zira nodded again, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had never imagined she would be in this situation, alone, lost, a stranger on a strange world. But for the first time, she didn't feel completely helpless. The humans had shown her their harshness, their fear, but Darnell had shown her something else, something she hadn't expected. Maybe humans weren't all cold and unfeeling. Maybe there was a part of them that still believed in kindness, in protecting others. She didn't know if all humans were like him, but for now, that was enough. She closed her eyes, the warmth of the blanket and the flicker of the fire lulling her to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Zira allowed herself to rest. For the first time in days, she felt a small measure of peace. The morning sun rose over the horizon, casting an orange glow over the dusty landscape. Zira stirred awake, the warmth of the blanket making her feel safe for the first time in days. She took a deep breath and slowly sat up, stretching her aching limbs. Her legs still throbbed with pain, but the rest had helped ease some of her exhaustion. She looked around the camp, where the soldiers were already packing up their gear. Captain Darnell was moving quickly, his eyes scanning the surroundings as he checked the equipment. He looked up when he noticed Zira, offering her a reassuring smile. "Good morning," he said as he approached her cot. "Ready to get moving?" Zira nodded, feeling the surge of determination. She had no choice but to keep moving. She couldn't stay in one place forever, waiting for the help she desperately needed. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was the only chance she had. With Darnell's help, Zira carefully got to her feet, her legs trembling as she took her first steps. The soldiers were packing their things, preparing for the long trek ahead. They moved in silence, their faces serious but not unfriendly. Zira knew they were still unsure about her. an alien in a world that had been harsh to her. But for now, they were allowing her to stay, and that was enough. Darnell led the way, his boots kicking up dust as he moved forward. Zara followed closely behind, her pace slow but steady. The heat of the planet's sun beat down on them, but the wind kept the air dry, whipping the sand and dust around them. As they walked, Zara couldn't help but wonder about the other humans she had encountered. Why had they turned her away so easily? She thought back to the faces of the people who had refused to help her, fear and suspicion written on their faces. They had seen her as a threat, something alien and dangerous, and that fear had been enough to drive them away. But Darnell was different. He didn't see her as a threat. He didn't treat her as if she was an enemy to be fought. He saw her as someone in need of help. For that, Zara was grateful. They walked for hours, the landscape slowly changing as they moved further from the barren hills. The terrain was rough and uneven, with rocks scattered across the ground. Zara stumbled a few times, but Darnell was always there, offering her a steady hand whenever she needed it. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, and the temperature had risen sharply. Zara's throat was dry, and she could feel the heat weighing down on her. She hadn't had water in what felt like forever, and it was starting to take its toll. Her mouth felt parched, and her steps were growing slower. Darnell noticed her struggling and stopped in his tracks. "We need to take a break," he said, looking at Zara with concern. "You're not in the best condition to keep going like this." Zara opened her mouth to protest, but she was too tired to argue. She nodded weakly and sank down to the ground, her legs too weak to keep standing. Darnell pulled out a canteen of water and offered it to her. Zara took it gratefully, drinking deeply. The cool water was a relief, soothing her dry throat and easing the burning sensation in her chest. "Thanks," she whispered after taking a few more gulps, feeling a little more refreshed. Darnell sat down beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll rest here for a while, but we need to keep moving," he said, his voice steady. "We're not far from the safe zone, but the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be." Zara nodded again, knowing he was right. She couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. But she also couldn't keep pushing herself too hard. Her body was fragile, her energy nearly gone, and it was a struggle to keep going. As the rest of the soldiers sat down to rest, Zara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her strength. She thought about her people again, about what had happened to her home, her family. Had anyone survived the crash? Were there any other Zortha out there? Or was she truly alone in the universe? Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "You all right?" Darnell asked, his eyes concerned. He had noticed the troubled look on her face. Zara nodded, though it was a lie. "I'm fine," she said, not wanting to burden him with her thoughts. She didn't know if she would ever find her people, or if she was doomed to wander alone. But she wasn't going to give up. Not yet. Darnell didn't push her for more, understanding that she needed time. Instead, he stood up and motioned for the others to gather their things. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. "We've got a few more miles to cover." The soldiers gathered their packs, and the small group continued their journey. Zara followed behind, her steps slower than the others, but she refused to give up. With each step, she reminded herself that she was not alone anymore. Darnell and his team were with her, and as long as they were, she had a chance. The afternoon dragged on, and the temperature began to drop slightly as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Zara felt the weariness in her bones, but she pushed through it. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going, but she couldn't stop now. As they approached the edge of a rocky cliff, Darnell stopped once more, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We're close," he said, his voice filled with hope. "The safe zone is just over this ridge. We'll rest there for the night." Zara felt a small wave of relief wash over her. She was almost there. The promise of safety, of answers, was so close. She could almost taste it. But the journey wasn't over yet. There was still much to face before she could find the peace she desperately sought. But for the first time in days, Zira felt a spark of hope in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for her in this world. The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged line cutting into the sky. Zira could see the faint outline of buildings in the distance, like a mirage, shimmering under the setting sun. The promise of the safe zone was so close now, just beyond the ridge. Her legs ached, and her body was exhausted, but she pushed herself forward, each step a reminder of how far she had come. Captain Darnell walked beside her, his presence a quiet but steady comfort. He had been silent for most of the day, but Zira could tell he was keeping an eye on her, making sure she didn't collapse from exhaustion. His steady pace and calm demeanor were the only things that kept her going. She was too tired to speak, but in her heart, she was thankful for his support. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature had dropped, and the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the chill of the evening. Zira shivered, the thin fabric of her clothes doing little to protect her from the cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to keep warm, but it wasn't enough. The cold seeped into her bones. Darnell noticed her discomfort and offered her a thermal blanket. "Here," he said, his voice soft. "It's not much, but it'll help keep you warm." Zira took the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. She nodded her thanks, but Darnell only gave a small smile and kept walking. The journey had been long and difficult, but they were almost there. Zira could feel the weight of the journey starting to lift as the safe zone grew closer, but as they crested the ridge, Zira's heart sank. The buildings that had looked so promising from a distance now appeared battered and damaged. The walls were cracked, and several of the structures were missing pieces, as if they had been abandoned or destroyed in a previous battle. It was nothing like what she had imagined. Darnell stopped at the top of the ridge, his expression hardening as he took in the sight. "This isn't what I expected," he muttered, his brow furrowed. He turned to his team. "Keep your guard up. This might not be the safe zone we thought it was." The soldiers behind him nodded, pulling out their weapons and falling into a defensive formation. Zira felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This place was supposed to offer safety, but now it felt like another danger waiting to happen. They began their descent into the area, moving cautiously through the abandoned streets. The silence was deafening. No one was there. No signs of life. No movement. It was as though the whole place had been deserted long ago. "Where is everyone?" Zira asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence. She didn't expect an answer, but Darnell turned to her with a grave expression. "Looks like we're not the only ones who have been struggling," he said. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't good." Zira's heart sank even further. She had been hoping for some kind of rescue, some safe haven where she could find answers. But now, all she could feel was a deep sense of uncertainty. They continued through the empty streets, the soldiers on high alert. Zira's mind raced with thoughts of what might have happened here. Was this the result of a war? A disease? Had the people of this place been wiped out by something even worse than what she had already experienced? The deeper they went, the more Zira began to feel like a ghost in her own body. The emptiness of the place made everything feel unreal. It was as though she had stumbled into a world that had forgotten how to live. They reached the center of the settlement, where a large building stood, its once pristine walls now cracked and weathered. Darnell motioned for the group to stop. "We'll check inside," he ordered. "Stay close." Zira followed them into the building, her heart pounding in her chest. The inside was dark, the windows shattered, and the air was thick with dust. It felt like they were walking through a forgotten memory, a place that time had left behind. Darnell motioned for Zira to stay close as they moved through the building's empty halls. There were signs that people had once lived here, old furniture, broken machines, scraps of food left behind. It looked like they had been in a hurry to leave, or perhaps they had been forced to leave. Zira's mind whirled with questions, but she had no answers. As they moved through the building, one of the soldiers stopped suddenly, his hand raised in warning. "Captain," he said in a low voice, "there's something up ahead." The group fell silent, their weapons raised, ready for whatever they might find. Zara felt a sense of dread crawl up her spine. What was waiting for them? They moved forward cautiously, Zara staying as close to Darnell as she could. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. At the end of the hallway, they found a door, slightly ajar. Darnell signaled for the group to stop. He approached the door slowly, his hand on his weapon, ready for anything. He pushed the door open, and what they saw made Zara's heart stop. Inside, the room was filled with equipment, medical supplies, weapons, and strange devices she didn't recognize. But it was the bodies that caught her attention. They were scattered across the floor, their faces frozen in fear. They were human, but they had been dead for some time. Zara gasped, her stomach turning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Darnell stepped forward, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. This is bad," he said quietly. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't just an evacuation. Something went wrong, and I don't know if we'll be able to find the answers we need." Zara stood frozen in place, her mind racing. Her hope for safety, for answers, was beginning to slip away. Whatever had destroyed this place was still out there, and she had no idea what it was. But one thing was clear: the danger wasn't over. They were far from safe. The air inside the abandoned building felt heavier now, filled with the stench of decay and the oppressive silence of a place long forgotten. Zara stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest. The bodies on the floor were a chilling reminder of the fate that had befallen the humans who had once lived here. Their faces were twisted in expressions of fear, eyes wide open in a final moment of terror. Zara's mind struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. She had come here seeking answers, hoping to find safety and maybe some survivors. Instead, she had found death. The bodies around her made it clear something horrible had happened, something that had wiped out these people and left this place in ruin. Darnell stepped forward, his expression hardening as he took in the scene. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any clues, any signs of what had caused this catastrophe. The other soldiers remained on edge, their weapons ready, but their eyes were filled with uncertainty. None of them seemed to know what to do next. "What happened here?" one of the soldiers muttered, his voice tight with unease. This place was supposed to be safe. Darnell didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt beside one of the bodies, inspecting it carefully. Zara could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of responsibility on him. He was their leader, and right now, the weight of the situation seemed to be crushing him. He stood up slowly, his face grim. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But whatever it wasn't natural." Zara couldn't stop herself from asking the question that had been gnawing at her since they had arrived. "Are there any survivors?" Her voice trembled with hope, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Darnell hesitated, looking around the room as if searching for any sign of life. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." He motioned for his team to search the building, and the soldiers moved quickly, checking rooms, looking for any hidden survivors or signs of what had happened. Zara stood still, trying to process everything. She wanted to believe there were survivors, but the emptiness around her seemed to suggest otherwise. The building had been abandoned, the streets outside eerily quiet. It didn't seem possible that anyone had made it out alive. As she turned to look out the cracked windows, her mind raced. Where was everyone? What had caused this destruction? Was this the result of a natural disaster, a disease, or something more sinister? Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. "Captain, we found something," one of the soldiers called from deeper in the building. Darnell motioned for Zara to follow him as he moved toward the soldier. The others had gathered around an open doorway, peering into a room filled with dusty old files and equipment. It looked like an old command center, the walls lined with old computers and monitors that no longer worked. In the center of the room was a large metal crate, its lock broken, its contents exposed. Zara stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. Inside the crate were strange devices, their shapes unlike anything she had ever seen before. They were sleek and metallic, with glowing blue lights embedded into their surfaces. There were several of them, each one connected to wires that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "What are these?" Zara asked, stepping forward to get a better look. Darnell examined the devices carefully. "I don't know," he said, his voice cautious. "But they're definitely not from around here. This tech, it's advanced, far beyond anything we have." Zara's heart skipped a beat. Could these strange devices be connected to the destruction of the settlement? Was this what had caused the deaths, the chaos? "Do you think these have something to do with what happened here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Darnell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for his team to take the devices carefully and secure them. "We'll need to take these back with us. They might be the key to understanding what happened." Zara watched as the soldiers carefully packed the devices into crates, making sure not to disturb them. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. These devices looked like they had been designed for something powerful, and the fact that they were left behind in such a way only made her more uneasy. The team gathered their things and began to move out of the building, heading back toward the streets. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Zara felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. The hope she had felt when they first arrived at the safe zone had quickly faded, replaced by a growing sense of fear. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice shaky. "We need to find shelter for the night," Darnell replied. "We'll regroup and plan our next move in the morning." Zara nodded, too tired to argue. As they moved through the empty streets, her mind kept returning to the strange devices they had found. What were they? And why had they been left behind? More importantly, what did they have to do with the deaths of so many people? The group found a building a few blocks away that appeared to be in better condition. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide some shelter for the night. Darnell gave orders for the team to set up a defensive perimeter and for everyone to get some rest. Zara didn't argue. She was exhausted, and the events of the day had left her drained. She needed time to process everything, to think through the questions that kept swirling in her mind. As she lay down on the cold floor of the building, her thoughts kept returning to the devices. There was something about them that unsettled her, something about the way they pulsed with energy, as if they were waiting for something. But what? She didn't know the answers. Not yet. But one thing was clear. She was no longer in a safe zone. This was a place of secrets, and the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it seemed. She closed her eyes, hoping for sleep, but her mind was too full of questions. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more dangers, and Zara had no idea what lay ahead. But she was determined to find out. Whatever it took, she would uncover the truth. And maybe, just maybe, she would find the answers she had been searching for. The morning sun broke through the cracks in the building's walls, casting a soft light across the room. Zara awoke with a start, her mind still heavy with the questions and unease of the previous day. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion, but the feeling of uncertainty still lingered. The events of the last few days had shattered her understanding of what was happening, and now she was more lost than ever. She sat up, taking a deep breath as she surveyed the room. Darnell and the soldiers were already awake, gathered around a makeshift table where the strange devices they had found were laid out. The flickering blue lights from the devices cast an eerie glow in the otherwise dark room. Zara slowly stood up and walked over to the table. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the devices up close. They looked even more out of place now, their smooth, metallic surfaces almost humming with an energy that made her skin crawl. There were 5 of them in total, each one slightly different, but all emitting the same unsettling glow. "Morning," Darnell said, his voice steady but filled with the same unease that Zira felt. He looked up at her as she approached. "How are you feeling?" Zira hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm okay. Just trying to make sense of all of this." She looked down at the devices. "Do you think these are the reason everyone is dead? That they caused all of this?" Darnell's expression was hard to read. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, then looked over at one of his soldiers. "We haven't figured out what they do yet, but they're definitely not ordinary. Whoever made these was highly advanced." Zira nodded. "And whoever made them, they're the ones who destroyed this place, right?" Darnell didn't answer right away. He glanced at the devices again, as if hoping they would reveal their secrets. "I don't know, but we're going to find out. We're heading to the research facility today. It's the only place that might have some answers." The mention of the research facility made Zira's heart race. The facility had been mentioned in some of the old records she had found during her travels, but she had never been able to learn much about it. It was said to be the place where humanity had made significant scientific discoveries, a hub of innovation. But now it felt like a place full of mysteries she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. "We're not going to be safe until we understand what these are and who made them," Darnell continued. "Whatever's out there, we need to be ready for it." Zira looked at the soldiers, each one preparing for what lay ahead. Their faces were grim, their eyes sharp. She could see the same fear she felt reflected in them. They knew something was coming, but they didn't know what. They packed up quickly, securing the strange devices and making sure their weapons were ready. Zira helped as best as she could, but her energy was low. She had never felt so drained before, physically and emotionally. Her journey had been long and full of hardship, and now, with the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, she wasn't sure how much more she could handle. Once everything was packed, the group set out toward the research facility. The streets outside were still eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. The once bustling settlement now felt like a ghost town, the buildings standing as hollow reminders of what had been lost. The journey to the research facility took longer than expected. The path was treacherous, the landscape littered with rubble and abandoned vehicles. It was clear that something had devastated the area, and it wasn't just the safe zone. The signs of destruction were everywhere. As they neared the facility, Zira felt a growing sense of dread. The building loomed ahead, its sleek design marred by cracks and scorch marks. It had clearly been hit by something powerful. The walls that had once been pristine were now damaged, as if they had been under attack. Darnell motioned for the group to halt as they approached the entrance. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low. "We don't know what we're walking into." Zira's heart pounded in her chest as they moved inside. The air inside the facility was thick with dust, the scent of old machinery and abandoned technology filling her nose. The facility was just as empty as the settlement, and the silence here was almost unbearable. They moved through the hallways, the clicking of their boots the only sound breaking the stillness. The facility's monitors and displays were all blank, their screens cracked and covered in dust. It looked like no one had been here for a long time. Zira felt a deep sense of unease. Something was wrong, and it was more than just the empty hallways and broken technology. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Darnell stopped in front of a large reinforced door. "This is the main research lab," he said. "This is where they were working on the devices." He motioned for the soldiers to stand guard as he approached the door. With a few quick commands, the door slid open, revealing a large room filled with computers, monitors, and large containers of unknown substances. But what caught Zira's attention was the large glass tank in the center of the room. Inside, a glowing blue light flickered. Zira stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. She peered into the tank, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Inside the tank was a creature, or at least it looked like one. Its body was humanoid but twisted, its skin a dark shade of green. The creature was floating in some sort of liquid, its eyes closed, but there was a sense of life in it. an energy that made Zira's skin crawl. "This is it," Darnell said, his voice filled with disbelief. "This is what they were working on." Zira took a step back. The creature in the tank wasn't just a product of science. It was something more. It was something dangerous. The answer to her questions was clearer now. These devices, the destruction of the settlement, the strange creature in the tank, they were all connected. And the people who had worked here had unleashed something they couldn't control. "We need to leave," Zira said, her voice shaking. "Whatever they were doing here, it's not safe." Darnell nodded, his expression hardening. "You're right. We need to get out of here, but we can't leave empty-handed. We need to take these devices with us. They're the key to understanding all of this." Zira didn't argue. She had learned one painful lesson already. They couldn't trust anyone, and they couldn't afford to be weak. The truth was out there, but it came with a price. The group gathered the devices and prepared to leave the facility. As they made their way back to the streets, Zira couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Something was waiting for them in the shadows, and whatever it was getting closer.